so much for being here. It's really a privilege to be talking to you, even in this strange online setting. And it's great to be thinking about something which is not COVID. So just listening to David's talk, I thought that I kind of forgot that the module is called The World of the Hero, and I haven't really talked about much about heroism or Aeneas at all, I think, in my lecture, but I guess that you can take Dido as a hero in many respects. So that would be something else that we can discuss as well. So I just wanted to say that I hope that you've had a chance to have a look at the lecture that I pre-recorded. It's material that I worked on quite hands-on because I wrote a book on Carthage in the Aeneid, and I'm now in the process of writing a book which is more for an outreach. It's more for a public engagement as much as it is for research on Dido and her reception. And I'm thinking especially about what Dido how she can speak to students of all ages, really. So I would just leave it to you and see if you have questions, and I'm happy to take questions as you have them. If you want to raise your hand, I can enable your video, I think, or I can reply to questions in the chat.
I was just wondering if you could, one of the peculiarities about this bit of the course, of course, is that you're doing Homer and Virgil simultaneously, which as a teacher, I haven't had to teach for an awfully long time, the two together, and ways of thinking about Dido and her relationship with female characters in the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Sure. I mean, there are a number, you can map Dido onto a number of characters in the Odyssey. Most clearly, I think the main model that you would get is the model of Phaeacia. So I don't remember if I touched upon this a little bit in the lecture, but the arrival of Aeneas at Carthage is very much like the arrival of Odysseus at Scheria. Similarly, Aeneas and Achates are a mist is poured over them by Venus so that the Carthaginians wouldn't approach them. And in the same way, Athena pours a mist over Odysseus, which I think is interesting in terms of getting a little bit of the sense that, you know, this is like Scheria, this is an enlightened civilization, but at the same time, there is sort of a danger of its counterpart. So in the same way as the Phaeacians are kind of the exact opposite of Cyclops. So they are also a little bit like Cyclops. There is always the danger that they may turn into Cyclops. I think that the same double characterization applies to the site of Carthage. And it's very interesting that when Aeneas arrives at Carthage, the first arrival in the harbor, so there are two arrivals, one is in the natural harbor and one is at the city. And the arrival in the harbor, as the Odyssean models actually there are the Cyclops, which similarly has like a natural harbor with an island in front of it so that it can make a safe haven. And at the same time, it's the arrival in Ithaca. So there is a cave of nymphs there, which is the same cave of nymphs in Ithaca where Odysseus leaves the gifts of the Phaeacians that were never heard of again. And so interesting, it's kind of arriving in a site which is both, you know, the most othered. I wouldn't say savage because I think that's a problematic name. And at the same time, it's a bit like home. So there are these two tensions there, I think. At the same time, of course, a lot has been said about Dido being like Nausicaa in a sense. Nausicaa herself has been perceived to be a threat, of course, to Odysseus. So Nausicaa herself arrives on the scene as a sort of would-be Calypso or would-be Circe, right? But at the same time, I think it's also interesting to think of Dido instead as a, well, not as a king in some sort of the male, but you know, she's not just Nausicaa. She's both Nausicaa and Nausicaa's father at the same time, just like she is Medea and she is Aeetes at the same time from Apollonius's Argonautica. These are just, I mean, I think some of the examples that we can think about. Another important one, I guess, is the scene at the temple, where the temple scenes at Carthage work for Aeneas in a similar way as the Song of Demodocus works for Odysseus, right? So Odysseus cries And in a similar way, Aeneas cries as recognizing himself, but it has been recognized that there is a lot of dramatic irony going on in here, because this is a temple in honor of Juno, who is the enemy, enemy deity of Aeneas and also of the Carthaginians. And some scholars have read the temple as doing exactly the opposite of what Aeneas thinks is doing, of depicting horrible scenes of the Greeks killing the Trojans, basically. And so Aeneas fundamentally misrepresents the scene. I don't know if this has answered some. There are many ways, I think, in which we could take her as not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's incredibly helpful. And unless somebody wants to jump in, I mean, I'll keep picking your brains, but flipping it round the other way, the ways in which Dido changes the sort of the paradigms that the Odyssey and the Iliad set for her. I don't know if you'd be able to just talk a little bit about that as well.
So you would say, I'm not sure how I would take her in relation to the Iliad here. I think it's interesting that Dido is very much a model for Aeneas himself, right? She's always a double for Aeneas at the same time. And in some ways, I guess you can say that Phaeacia works like that for the Odyssey as well, in terms of being a sort of utopia. But Carthage is a very different place in that respect, because it is a real place, and because there is a history behind it which is on top of whatever Homer could have done. So I think that in that respect, it would be extremely helpful to have the epic, the Roman epics, especially Naevius, well, and I mean also Ennius, of course, to see what Dido could be doing in that respect that is not Homeric. And obviously the ancient commentators took Dido, especially book 4. I mean, Servius tells us that Virgil took the whole of book 4 from Apollonius's Orgonautica book 3. So, and we can think that maybe the Roman epics were kind of on, of course they were post-Homeric, but they were also very much in line with the Hellenistic epos. So I see that in that tradition, which I don't think helps the students at all, because that kind of complicates the matter a little bit. But I wonder what the students take from it in terms of, in general, of Latin epic being, much more, well, it's kind of, you can't really get away from history in a sense, right? And from the military history of Rome. So I don't know if that helps at all, but in the lecture, sorry.
Yeah, it's very helpful for me. I'm just at the start of the thing, so I'm still with the Iliad. So I've got the Aeneid's a long way off yet, but I'll find out at some point in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I have thought about Dido as well as she's a bit like Helen in some respects. There are links to it, like Aeneas gives her gifts that belong to Helen. And there is a reference at a certain point in a simile of Dido. Dido is like Diana on the shores of the Eurota, which is the river from which Helen was kidnapped. So there is a sense that she's very much not a Helen, right? So I think she is a Helen in respect in which there seems to be a way in which women are in the middle of this Western-Eastern conflicts, and it's a tradition that goes as far as Helen or as Herodotus. But Dido is very much a different kind of character in that respect. She is the one who kidnaps women from the island of Cyprus, according to another tradition. She is the one who gathers all the companions and leaves to found a city in the West. So it's interesting how the Helen model is sort of turned around in her case. So students love looking, Rebecca says, they love looking at the comparison between Dido and Nausicaa and between Dido and Medea. I don't know, Rebecca, if you want to share something, if you see these comparisons are kind of working one against the other or working together. I think what I was trying to say in the lecture is that there seems to be a long tradition of taking Dido as necessarily intertextual and necessarily having models, and necessarily these models being in Greek or Latin literature, rather than in her own tradition. And what I wondered about is to what extent that is problematic in terms of her characterization. So she's always like other women that these male heroes have to recognize. I don't know if this makes sense, and if this is the kind of thing that can be presented to students. So Nausicaa is the would-be bride in a sense. She's also a charmer, possibly. There's a Calypso model in the background. Medea is, I mean, obviously, I've talked about this kind of the Amazon complex, as Format Cycling called it in these texts. So the women who do not really conform to what is asked of them, and so they are always hiding this threat of extreme violence. And of course, Medea is an instantiation of that, and in some senses, Dido is as well. So, but I do wonder to what extent that necessarily aligns us with the perspective of a male reader, and whether that is helpful for the students, or if we can teach them to find other ways to think about Dido.
I am sorry, if okay if I interrupt.
Yes, please.
It's Rebecca. Hello. I must admit I haven't had a chance to watch your lecture before the discussion. So sorry if I ask questions that you've already addressed. No, I just thought I'd say that I do introduce the comparison with Dido, with Nausicaa, and with Medea, and they enjoy looking at the comparison, obviously, with the Odyssey that they would have already studied, and also we kind of jump over to Medea and Jason as well. I suppose what I generally teach about Virgil, I'll just see what other people do, is that he obviously takes inspiration from what's come before him, knowing that his audience would be aware of these myths and this literature, and that he plays with it in different ways. So even though Dido isn't the same, but he's feeding these different women into her, and it's kind of whether or not it's making some sort of comment about who Dido is or who she's supposed to be. We also look at a comparison between Dido and Cleopatra as well. So we kind of just explore how she's put together as a character, but then how she stands within her own right as well, what changes are made.
Thank you. I think this is very helpful. I mean, I do talk a little bit about this, and of course about the Cleopatra model as well, which is another constructed character, of course, and for propagandistic purposes. I do wonder to what extent, especially at school level, students are introduced. I mean, of course, they are doing, Homer at the same time, but are they introduced first to how Dido is a model, is drawn upon Nausicaa and Medea before they're introduced to how Dido is drawn upon her own tradition? I think that is what I'm wondering about, because I mean, according to the tradition, there was also an historian writing at the same time as Virgil, Pompeius Trogus, whose history we have in an epitome by Justin, but that we know was writing at the time of Virgil, and was writing a completely different story of Dido, where Dido never meets Aeneas, and part of which tradition is sort of fed into Aeneid 1. So, and we know that ancient readers would have recognized this meeting between Dido and Aeneas to be completely fictitious. And I think it's interesting that, we teach students to see what Virgil is doing in making this fiction. But I guess I wonder about, which one comes first. And what I found interesting with students, at least at university level, is that while they're very familiar with the Dido book 4, and this kinds of answers a little bit Giles' question, but I'd like to hear from you as well about whether Dido is sympathetic or unsympathetic to the students. My feeling is that when they normally read book 4 before they read book 1, which is a way in which Virgil himself, I think, created book 4. He created it as a book to be read on his own, and he skillfully divided the moment in which we know that Dido has fallen in love with Aeneas because she has been tricked by the gods and by this epic and by this author, and Dido in love. So he has created a double reading of this character. But book one is the book where we recover that different figure of Dido, so Dido, the leader of her people, etc. And students who read book one have a different perspective. I mean, in my experience, they seem to have a different reading and a different perspective of Dido.
Well, I do in order. So I kind of we do book one, and then book four will follow after we do book one, book two, book four. Sure. Okay. And I look at Dido obviously as a model for leadership and her comparison with Aeneas. But to be honest, I have a nod to her as a historical figure or as someone that they would have been aware of. I do talk about that, but I don't probably talk about her and her own tradition. Like you said, was it Strabus? That is probably something that I need to draw in, really. Is that something that I must admit I kind of skim over a little bit, which I think there's probably a lot more to be had from discussing that.
I think there is helpful material for A levels. It's for A level Latin, but it can be applied to the world of the hero in the commentary by Ingo Gildenhard, which is open access. I can put it in the chat, but so it's online, and there is some helpful material for students and text to read about the tradition, which I think would be good for them to look at. So I wonder about the so the sympathetic, so students are very much. Do you think there is a gender divide with the sympathetic or unsympathetic picture of either?
I think most of mine are quite sympathetic. I think that they feel like she's a bit of a victim, if not of what happens with Aeneas, but of the gods. You know, that kind of she ends up being a bit of a victim in that sense. So most of my students feel quite sympathetic towards her, I think. I'd say both male and female ones. My experience. I
don't know if Giles, if you want to chip in and say something. I'll post. This is Ingo Gilder. It should be online. It's pretty online too.
Sure. Hello. Yes. Well, perhaps it's not the best, kind of analysis that they come up with, but they'll say, "Oh, she's a drama queen. She should get over Aeneas. She makes too much of a fuss about it all." So I try to put arguments the other side. I just wondered if other people had the same sort of struggle against their students to try to get them to understand Dido's plight a bit better and become a bit more sympathetic to her.
I think in my lecture, I do refer to this comment by the French feminist Hélène Chisot, who just says that Dido is the worst model for feminism for her because she kind of inhabits victimhood. And it's interesting that that kind of legacy lives on. So she hasn't been a heroine of feminist reception in a way. She's not an Antigone, or Medea is not a great model, I guess, for feminism either, for obvious reasons. But she has been co-opted, right, into feminist or proto-feminist causes in a way that I think it has happened a little bit with Dido. But there is something, I think, exactly, about these over-reliance on the on Aeneas, in a sense, in book 4, which can make her perhaps an unsympathetic character.
I think it's interesting that she seems to be doing absolutely fine on her own, running her city, running her country. She's sort of powerful, in control, has recovered from the traumas that she's previously experienced. And Aeneas seems to kind of knock that all out of kilter. So, and she seems to lose all of her respect from her people, and then can't sort of continue without Aeneas. So I guess from that point of view, from a feminist perspective, obviously, is pretty bad that she sort of suffers greatly with her encounter with Aeneas on all levels.
I wonder.
The man ruins it. Yes.
Exactly. What's the students' take on this, and to what extent do they see the intervention of Venus and Juno in this story as taking away that agency from Dido, and whether that change, because sometimes it doesn't really seem that excuses her at all. So sometimes there's you know, Venus's trick of making Dido fall in love with Aeneas through what are, I think, motherhood instincts in a sense, right? She falls in love as she is holding Ascanius in her hands and in her lap, and Ascanius is actually Cupid, and she's listening to Aeneas, and she's drinking, and there's all this sort of Cleopatra-like, and she seems to be co-opted into this history and myth, which was not really part of her own myth. To what extent, yeah, they see that episode as you know, as necessary in order to understand what is going on with Dido, and to what extent she is a pawn in the hands of destiny, the gods.
I suppose, like we were saying about her as a victim, that my students kind of see her as a victim of the gods, and we talk about it with Aeneas as well. But then, yeah, what kind of victim? And if you're going to kind of hold that against her from the point of view of a feminist angle, being a victim, so there's different, you know, victims of different things going on here. So if you say that it's of the gods, it's slightly different to maybe a victim of what happens with Aeneas, because it is kind of the gods' fault. It is Juno and Aphrodite, or Juno and Venus, Venus's intervention. Yeah.
I don't know if there are other questions, but I think one thing that maybe is interesting to think about, I don't know how much the students think about this at all, is this threatening aspect of Dido, sort of Medea-like in a sense. And I talk a little bit about that in the lecture in book 4, and to what extent. And sometimes when you study this in Latin, I think it's really clear that there's a switching roles between the two continuously. And there's a moment in which Dido says to herself, after she finds out that Aeneas is leaving her and betraying her, she says, now impious deed, facta impia, she calls them, touch your mind. And commentators are completely divided about which impious deeds these are. So whether they refer to her own impious behavior of having betrayed the shadow of her dead husband, or whether they refer to the impious betrayal of Aeneas, whether that's her own betrayal, whether it's the betrayal of his previous wife Creusa, whom he completely abandoned in Troy, right? Or whether it's even the betrayal of his own city, which some commentators believe is something that is alluded to in the epic at points. So of Aeneas, the fact that Aeneas made a deal with the Greeks, and that this was a tradition, and left Troy to the Greeks in exchange of saving his own family. And there's this moment that he recognizes himself in the temple scene at Carthage, and he is mixing with the Greeks. And ancient commentators are already wondering to what extent that is something that is portrayed there, his betrayal of Troy in the temple scenes, and so something that Dido is aware of, and nevertheless, because of the gods or because of psychological reasons, she kind of believed in this man. And I think that is interesting that is playing with what were very allied stereotypes of Carthaginians at the time. So Carthaginians were stereotyped as untrustworthy people. There is a sense of this already in the Odyssey. I don't know if these are passages that you treat at all in the world of the hero, but especially in the Odyssey, there's encounters with the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians kidnap Eumaeus when he is a little boy, and this stereotype lives on and then becomes a live stereotype. It was called punica fides in Roman times. So Virgil is kind of playing with that, but he's also sometimes flipping it around. So it is applied, it can be applied to Dido, but really it seems to be applied to Aeneas as well. So I don't know if that is something that is worth looking at as well.
Yeah, definitely. I hadn't thought of that. I don't know about anyone else. I hadn't pushed it over to as in depth with Aeneas.
Right, yeah. I mean, I would be surprised if students took Aeneas as a sympathetic character in book 4. So they may not feel for Dido, but...
Yeah, my students are usually very sympathetic towards Dido, one reason or another, but not so much with Aeneas. I think they see her as quite weak for book 4.
I have...
Yes, I had a question from just that point in your talk. You talked about the significance of the the was it varium et mutabile femina or something like that. And if you just explain again the bit about the use of the neuter being important there. So I think.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry. The importance of this line.
Oh no, of the neuter gender.
Ah, yes. I mean, I think it's interesting that when you read it in Latin, what Mercury is saying to Aeneas, he says, varium et mutabile semper. So what he's saying is a variable or diverse, right? Varium can also mean, you know, something that changes completely, and mutabile, so fickle, a thing, and that he's using the neuter. And we don't really know until we get to the next line, we don't really know what he's applying that to. And then he applies it to femina. And femina, I think readers would remember, is also the term by which Dido herself in book 1 was represented by Venus, perhaps partly sarcastically, well, not sarcastically, but there's an element of surprise when Venus calls her the dux femina. There is something that is not quite right there. And one can wonder, you know, to what extent femina does a job which is different from mulier, but femina as a category of womanhood, right? So my point about the neuter was a point about objectification of, you know, of something that almost dehumanization of something that we have to try and understand, right, as if it was an object that is not quite right. There is something I think about the mutability of foreigners as well, and especially I think that especially the model of Egypt is important here. The model of Egypt as the model there is the model of Proteus in particular, who is this mutable god, when in some cases it becomes a symbol for Egypt herself. So, and there is also a line on Proteus when Aeneas arrives at the harbor at Carthage, and Dido is a little bit like Cleopatra. So it's a sense of this place that I talked about in the lecture that is ambiguous, that it's quite difficult to pin it down to understand what it is. But my point was that we as readers seem to side with Mercury and with Aeneas and with all the scholars as well, who seem to make sense of Dido according to the other women that she looks like. And these women are themselves put in boxes, right? So, oh, is she a little bit like the stepmother, the wicked stepmother like Phaedra, or is she a little bit like the barbarous Medea or Nausicaa or Helen? And all of them kind of are there to have a function and to make sense of Dido as an object that we have to understand. I don't know if this makes sense to you, but that is how I take this.
It makes a lot of sense. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so time's up. I'm sorry that the religious aspect of Dido, I didn't say much. I don't know if that related to Punic Dido, or not, but there is something in the lecture that I added to on how she can be mapped onto Tanit and Astarte in particular, and Punic religious aspects that are actually quite whitewashed in this epic, as Tanit is replaced with Juno in particular, and Astarte in part with Diana as well.